Nobody was supposed to hear what Princess Charlotte said that night. It wasn't part of a speech, it wasn't caught on camera, and it wasn't meant for the world. But according to reports circulating inside royal circles, one quiet sentence spoken during a private family dinner left Prince William and Princess Catherine completely shaken. Not because it was rude or dramatic, but because it was painfully honest. The kind of honesty that adults spend years trying to protect children from. And once those words were spoken, there was no taking them back. The evening itself was meant to be ordinary by royal standards. A rare, uninterrupted night at Adelaide Cottage, just William, Catherine, and their 3 children sitting down to dinner without staff hovering or schedules looming. No cameras. No expectations. Just a simple roast chicken, familiar routines, and the comfort of family. George chatted about football. Louis negotiated for extra food. And Charlotte, usually thoughtful but quietly observant, barely touched her plate. At first, nothing about her silence seemed alarming. Children have moods. Parents notice, but they don't panic. Not yet. Then, in a lull between conversations, Charlotte spoke, calmly, clearly. She said that sometimes she wished she wasn't a princess. That maybe if she weren't, everyone wouldn't be so worried all the time. That maybe her mom wouldn't be sick. That maybe they could all just be normal without people watching and judging everything they did. The words didn't come out dramatically. There were no tears, no raised voice, and that's what made them land so hard. The room went completely still. George froze mid-bite. Louis looked up, sensing something serious had just happened, even if he didn't fully understand why. Catherine reached instinctively for her water glass, her face draining of color. William didn't move at all. For several seconds, no one spoke. It wasn't shock at what Charlotte had said. It was shock at how deeply she understood what she was saying. Catherine was the first to respond, gently asking what had made Charlotte think about that. But Charlotte didn't rush to explain. She shrugged and said it was just something she'd been thinking about for a while. William tried to reframe it, talking about responsibility, about helping people, about the good that comes with their role. But Charlotte interrupted him, something she almost never did. She said she already knew all of that. Everyone always said those things. It didn't change the fact that things felt hard and sad a lot of the time, and she could tell by how her parents looked when they thought. Nobody was watching. That was the moment that truly broke the room, because there was no way to deny it. Charlotte wasn't guessing. She was observing. The rest of the meal passed quietly, the earlier warmth gone. By bedtime, the weight of what had happened hung over the house. And later that night, according to accounts from those close to the family, Charlotte shared more as Catherine helped her get ready for bed. Charlotte explained that she could always tell when her mom was having a difficult day, even when she tried to hide it. She noticed when smiles didn't reach her eyes, when movements were slower, when conversations stopped abruptly as soon as children entered the room. She admitted she'd overheard comments about pressure, about schedules, about recovery. Not because anyone told her, but because she was listening. Charlotte also spoke about how tired her father seemed sometimes, how hard he worked to hold everything together, how being royal felt like never being allowed to show sadness or fear. And then she said something that reportedly devastated Catherine. She admitted that some nights when her mom came to check on her before bed, she pretended to be asleep. Not because she didn't want comfort, but because she didn't want to add one more thing her mom had to worry about. But perhaps the most unsettling part was when Charlotte talked about herself. She said she'd been thinking about the future, about what would be expected of her, about people watching her the way they watched her mother. She mentioned moments that stuck with her. A photographer shouting for her to smile. Palace staff discussing how her image would need to be managed as she got older. Children at school asking questions after seeing her family in the news. None of it dramatic on its own, all of it heavy together. She said she sometimes wished she could just be Charlotte instead of Princess Charlotte. When Catherine asked what the difference was, her daughter answered simply. Charlotte was who she was when nobody was watching. Princess Charlotte was who everyone needed her to be. Looking back, the warning signs had been there for months. Subtle changes that were easy to explain away at the time. Charlotte growing quieter after summer, spending more time alone, hesitating before public appearances, teachers noticing she seemed more serious than other children her age, staff observing that she spoke less during car rides, George quietly sensing something was wrong but not knowing how to say it even. Catherine remembered moments that now felt painfully obvious. Charlotte asking whether joining the royal family had been scary, asking if it was hard to learn all the rules, asking whether Catherine had ever wished she could be normal. At the time, those questions felt like curiosity. Now, it was clear Charlotte was searching for reassurance about feelings she didn't know how to name by Monday morning. The situation had quietly reached senior palace staff. Details were limited, but the concern was real. If a 9-year-old was already struggling with the weight of royal life, it raised uncomfortable questions. Advisors reportedly met behind closed doors. Child specialists were consulted. King Charles was briefed carefully, according to sources. He listened in silence before asking what support Charlotte was receiving and what William and Catherine needed. A family meeting was scheduled. Not out of panic, but recognition. This wasn't about one comment. It was about what that comment revealed. Charlotte's position, not heir, not far removed, the only daughter, placed her in a uniquely vulnerable space. She carried visibility without clarity, expectation without definition. And on top of that, she had watched her mother battle serious illness under public scrutiny. For Catherine, the realization was devastating. Charlotte had learned the same hyper-awareness Catherine herself had developed years earlier, the sense of being watched, judged, and measured at all times. Catherine had hoped her children would be shielded from that until they were old enough to process it. Instead, her daughter was already carrying it. That night, Catherine barely slept. And by morning, something had shifted. Watching Charlotte anxiously pick at her breakfast, worried she'd done something wrong by being honest, Catherine made a decision. This would stop here. Whatever adjustments were needed, they would happen. The changes began immediately. Charlotte was quietly withdrawn from upcoming public appearances. Therapy was arranged, framed as support, not correction. Catherine blocked off time in her schedule that couldn't be touched. One-on-one time became non-negotiable, and discussions began about what this meant not just for Charlotte, but for George and Louis too. Nothing was announced dramatically. No public crisis. No dramatic statements. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had been revealed. A child had said what adults had been trying not to hear. And once spoken, it couldn't be ignored. Because sometimes it isn't rebellion that changes institutions. Sometimes it's a 9-year-old telling the truth of the dinner table. But what made this situation feel even bigger than one emotional family moment was what happened next. Because once Charlotte's words were spoken, the question inside the household wasn't just, how do we comfort her? It was, how did she get to this point without anyone realizing what she'd been carrying? And when adults start asking that kind of question, it stops being a bedtime conversation. It becomes a crisis of structure. By the next morning, the mood inside Adelaide Cottage had changed. Not in a dramatic, shouting way. In a quieter, more unsettling way. The kind where everyone is polite, everyone is calm, and nobody is actually okay. Charlotte, by most accounts, looked anxious. Not because she regretted what she said, but because she could feel that she'd shifted the adults around her into a different mode. Children always notice that shift. They may not understand politics or institutions, but they understand energy. And the energy in that house was suddenly heavier. William tried to keep breakfast normal. He asked George about school. He made Louis laugh. He smiled at Charlotte the way he always did. But there was a tightness behind it, like he was holding something together with invisible tape. Catherine, on the other hand, couldn't hide it as easily. She watched Charlotte carefully, almost too carefully, like she was trying to read every expression, every pause, every glance away from the table. And for Charlotte, that attention probably felt like proof that she had done something wrong. Even though nobody told her that. That's the part people don't talk about enough. When kids finally say the truth, the adults panic, and then the kid thinks the truth was dangerous. That's how silence becomes a habit. According to reports, Catherine made a point of correcting that early. She took Charlotte aside later that morning and told her clearly that she wasn't in trouble, that she wasn't too much, that being honest wasn't something she'd ever be punished for. And Charlotte, who had reportedly been trying to act normal, finally cracked a little. Not with a meltdown, but with quiet tears. The kind you wipe away fast because you don't want to upset any. So when his own daughter quietly said she wished she wasn't a princess, it didn't just sting. It hit a wound he thought he'd already closed. And then comes the part that reportedly triggered the most intense conversations behind the scenes. Charlotte didn't just say she wanted out. She linked her mother's illness to the fear and stress surrounding them. Now, nobody can prove what a 9-year-old meant in a psychological sense. But what she expressed, at least in the way it's been reported, was a child trying to assign cause to pain. A child who has seen a parent struggle and has been searching for an explanation that makes sense. That's exactly the kind of thinking child specialists watch for. Not because the child is broken, but because it signals a kid who is taking responsibility for things they can't control. And in a family where control is always a theme, control of image, control of schedule, control of narrative, that kind of emotional burden can grow fast. So, reportedly, a specialist was consulted quietly, carefully, and what happened next wasn't a grand intervention. It was a recalibration. Charlotte's public appearances were adjusted. Not because she had done something wrong, but because the family reportedly realized something uncomfortable. Every time Charlotte stepped into a public event, she wasn't just waving. She was performing, and she knew it. That was the alarming part. Not the waving. The awareness. At the same time, Palace Communications had a separate fear. Because the royal family doesn't just manage reality. It manages perception of reality. And this kind of story-an emotional confession from a princess doesn't stay private forever. It leaks. Maybe not as a direct quote, but as a vibe, as a whisper, as sources close to the family say. And once that happens, K-Poll fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. And if there's one thing the last few years have proven, it's that the public is always ready to fill in blanks with the most dramatic version possible. We've seen it again and again. Rumors taking off online, claims multiplying with every repost. People turning private health situations into public theories. Entire timelines built out of speculation. And in the royal world, those storms don't just pass. They stick. They shape reputations. They build pressure. And for a child like Charlotte, just knowing those storms exist can feel like living under a ceiling that could fall at any moment. That's why, according to reports, there was urgency around controlling how any changes were framed. If Charlotte pulled back from public appearances, it couldn't look like fear. It had to look like family time. If Catherine reduced work, it couldn't look like collapse. It had to look like prioritizing recovery. If William drew a boundary, it couldn't look like rebellion. It had to look like modern parenting, because the moment the public smells crisis, the headlines write themselves. And here's where the story, according to what's being said, takes a more complicated turn. Because protecting Charlotte isn't just a parenting decision. It's a political decision. If William and Catherine create a model where royal children are shielded deeply, it raises a question. Why wasn't it always this way? And that question opens doors the monarchy doesn't love opening. It pulls Diana back into the conversation. It pulls William's childhood back into the spotlight. It pulls Harry back into the narrative too, because whether people like it or not, Harry's break from the institution changed the public's expectations. It planted the idea that stepping away is possible. And once the public believes something is possible, they start asking why more people don't do it. Now, to be clear, there's no verified indication that Charlotte is leaving anything. She's 9. This is about emotion, not formal decisions. But the way the internet works, people don't wait for nuance. They build futures out of a single sentence. So inside the palace, reportedly, the discussions weren't just, how do we help Charlotte feel safe? They were also, how do we prevent the narrative from becoming bigger than the reality? And then, according to claims from those who follow royal insiders closely, the situation reached King Charles. His response, as described by sources, was quiet concern mixed with something heavier recognition. Because Charles knows what it's like to be shaped by duty as a child. He knows what it's like to be raised for a role rather than raised for joy. And even if he believes in the institution, it's hard to hear that your granddaughter is already feeling crushed by it. That's why a meeting was reportedly arranged at Windsor, bringing together the family and a small circle of trusted voices. And among those voices, there was one person whose perspective carries a very specific weight: Princess Anne. Because Anne is the royal who never asked for softness. She grew up under expectation and simply absorbed it. She has always represented the just get on with it school of monarchy. So if even Anne is sitting in a room discussing how to protect a child from pressure, that tells you the situation is being treated as serious. But the tension is obvious. William and Catherine's instinct is protection. The institution's instinct is continuity. And those instincts don't always align. What makes this even more delicate is that Charlotte sits in a unique position. George has a clear path. Heavy, yes, but defined. Louis has distance, which usually brings freedom. Charlotte is in the middle, which often brings confusion. She's important enough to be watched closely, but not given a destiny that explains the watching. And for a child, that can feel like being judged without knowing the rules. That's why her statement about wanting to just be Charlotte instead of Princess Charlotte hits so hard, because it suggests she already understands that there are two versions of her life. One is hers. One is for everybody else, and here's the part that reportedly affected Catherine the most. Not the palace reaction. Not the advisors. Not the future planning. It was the quiet guilt that comes when you realize your child has been studying your pain. Catherine has always been praised for composure, for calm, for grace under pressure. But what if that composure is exactly what made Charlotte worry more? Because when children don't see struggle acknowledged, they assume it's unmanageable. They assume it has to be hidden. They assume talking about it will make it worse. So Catherine, according to reports, made a decision that wasn't about press strategy or protocol. It was about breaking a pattern. She began being more emotionally open with Charlotte in small, safe ways. Not burdening her, not oversharing, but letting her see that grown-ups can admit hard days and still be okay. Letting her see that feelings aren't dangerous. That sadness isn't failure. That stress doesn't mean the family is breaking. Because if Charlotte learned anything from watching her parents, it was that silence equals strength. Catherine reportedly wanted her to learn something else instead. Honesty equals safety. And once that shift began, the ripple effects touched the whole household. George, who is old enough to understand more than he's supposed to, reportedly became quieter too, not because he was jealous of attention, but because his sister's confession probably made him wonder what he's allowed to feel. If Charlotte can say it out loud, does that mean he can too? Or does it mean he should never say it because his role is bigger? That's a scary question for a 12-year-old. Louis. Younger probably sensed the mood and did what younger siblings do. He tried to fix it with jokes, with extra energy, with being easy so the adults wouldn't worry more. And that, in its own way, is another kind of performance. Another child adapting to tension by becoming what the room needs, which is exactly the thing Charlotte was describing. So yes, this moment may have started with one sentence at dinner, but it didn't end at dinner. It turned into a mirror. And once the mirror was there, the family had to look. Because what happens when the most emotionally honest person in the room is a 9-year-old? And what happens when she says out loud the thing everyone else has been trained not to say? But the biggest question still hung over everything, unspoken but obvious. If Charlotte is already feeling this now, what happens when she's 13? When she's 16? When the world starts judging her looks, her expressions, her outfits, her friendships, her every move? When people stop calling her adorable and start calling her problematic for having a face that doesn't smile on command? That's the point where royal childhood becomes royal adolescence. And the palace has seen what that can do. And according to reports, William and Catherine were determined not to let it swallow their daughter, because sometimes the most dangerous part of a royal life isn't the crown. It's the constant feeling that you're never allowed to be a person. And Charlotte, in one quiet moment, exposed that. But there's one more piece to this that people keep whispering about. The part that suggests the palace didn't just respond with concern, but with fear. Because when a child voices something this real, doesn't just create a parenting challenge.